One of the near-death experience cases that Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross documented in her archives began with an event that deeply intrigued her, not because of the patient, but because of the behavior of his dog. The patient, a 58-year-old man, suffered a sudden cardiac arrest during emergency heart surgery. According to hospital records, his heart remained without detectable electrical activity for 7 full minutes while the medical team performed chest compressions and defibrillation. At the same time, as witnesses later reported, the family's old Labrador, who was waiting in the ICU waiting room, began to howl constantly, restless, refusing comfort from anyone who tried to calm him down. The episode was described by 3 different people and recorded by the patient's daughter, who took notes on the time. When the man finally regained consciousness weeks later, he reported not only seeing the medical team fighting for his life, but also perceiving the dog's presence, as if the animal could see or sense him at the moment he described as leaving the body. For Kübler-Ross, this wasn't a case of sentimentality, but a piece of field data worthy of investigation. She always approached such episodes with a method she called the search for patterns, identifying repetitions across different accounts without yielding to easy supernatural explanations. What impressed her was not the isolated coincidence, but the accumulation of cases where pets seemed to react to critical moments of their owner's transition, whether it was at the moment of clinical death or during long periods of coma. In private conference notes, Kübler-Ross observed that ancient texts from various cultures already recorded that certain animals, especially dogs, showed agitation at the moment a loved one departed or stayed for long periods in front of the burial site. She never took such accounts as proof of reincarnation, but considered them anthropological data on the human perception that animals could react to something that escapes common senses. When analyzing this specific case, she firmly maintained her clinical skepticism. She pointed out that dogs and other animals have extremely acute senses. They can detect minimal variations in the odor released by metabolic changes or subtle changes in their owner's heart rate, and they even react to electrical and hormonal fluctuations before a collapse. These physiological factors could partially explain the animal's behavior. However, the coincidence between the patient's reported vision of seeing his dog near him while his body was being resuscitated and the animal's recorded agitation remained an open question that required more than a purely materialistic explanation. The patient described that, during the episode, he had the impression of crossing a luminous barrier where he was greeted by human figures he identified as deceased relatives, and, to his surprise, he also perceived the calm presence of the still-living Labrador. He recounted that the dog was staring at him, wagging its tail, but without its usual enthusiasm, as if it recognized the situation and was waiting for something. Kübler-Ross recorded that accounts of this type, in which animals appear as companions in the crossing, parallel ancient traditions about journeys after death, in which a faithful animal guides or protects the traveler's spirit. The doctor emphasized that her work was not to confirm spiritual doctrines, but to understand human phenomena on the frontiers of consciousness. Her central question wasn't whether the dog saw the soul or recognized reincarnation, but whether, in the extreme states of near death, the human mind might emit signals, conscious or not, that sensitive animals pick up and respond to. This doubt, maintained with scientific rigor, remained one of the points of greatest fascination in her archives. Among the prolonged coma cases analyzed by Kübler-Ross, one of the most challenging involved a 42-year-old woman, a victim of a car accident that caused her severe cranioencephalic trauma. She remained in a deep coma for nearly 5 months. During this period, the medical team recorded minimal vegetative responses with no signs of consciousness. The detail that caught the researchers' attention wasn't in the electroencephalogram charts, but in the behavior of the patient's cat. According to family members, the animal, previously independent and aloof, began to sleep constantly at the head of the owner's bed, even in the ICU, where it was allowed to stay on controlled occasions. There were reports that, on some nights, The cat would stand up and fix its gaze on a spot above the patient's head, as if following something invisible, a behavior that impressed even the nurses. When the patient finally regained consciousness, she described an experience that had stretched out like a continuous narrative during the coma. She recounted crossing landscapes that oscillated between illuminated fields and shadowy zones, always accompanied, intermittently, by a small feline figure that silently guided her through narrow passages and across a river. She said seemed to be made of light. She reported that this feline presence conveyed serenity to her, and that at certain moments, when she felt lost, she just had to follow the animal to find her way again. For Kübler-Ross, the description was notable not only for the clarity of the details, but for the fact that, upon waking, the woman was able to describe with precision external events that occurred during the deep coma. For example, she mentioned a nurse changing shifts, the sound of a heart monitor that went off one specific morning, and the arrival of a new resident doctor. The team confirmed that these events, noted in the medical records, had actually occurred. This type of correlation, though rare, was a turning point for the researcher. It showed that part of the patient's perception could not be easily attributed to common dream hallucinations. In analyzing this episode, Kübler-Ross once again resorted to the skepticism that characterized her method. She pointed out that it is plausible that auditory or tactile fragments could be picked up by the brain even in a comatose state and later integrated into experience narratives. She admitted, however, that the coincidence between the constant presence of the cat next to the headboard and the feline figure perceived by the patient in the accounts of her journey was not something that could be explained only by external stimuli. She also observed that, in very ancient texts, there are mentions of animals acting as guides in the passages to another form of existence, which led her to consider the possibility of a common cultural archetype that emerges in altered states of consciousness. Kübler-Ross always reminded colleagues that studying these experiences didn't mean taking the idea of reincarnation as a literal truth. The goal, she said, was to map the unknown territory of human perceptions on the border between life and death. For her, the behavior of animals in these contexts could have value as observational data, perhaps revealing a sensitivity to signs not yet understood by modern physiology. She wondered if the intense affective bond between humans and their animals could create a type of subtle communication in situations of extreme risk, without committing to spiritual explanations. This attitude of rigor and doubt differentiated her from many popular interpreters of near-death experiences. Kübler-Ross insisted that science should, before discarding or accepting such accounts, investigate them with the same seriousness devoted to altered states induced by brain trauma or psychedelic substances. In these episodes, the presence or perception of animals seemed to repeat itself consistently enough to warrant systematic study, especially because it crossed cultures and eras. Among the most unsettling records Elisabeth Kübler-Ross analyzed was that of a 26-year-old man who suffered cardiorespiratory arrest after drowning in a lake. He was clinically dead for nearly 9 minutes before being resuscitated and later remained in a coma for 12 days. The experience he described upon waking contrasted sharply with accounts of luminous fields and peaceful encounters with loved ones. He recounted crossing a dark, cold environment where he heard sounds of lament and felt an oppressive sense of isolation. Among the most vivid images he reported was the presence of somber-looking dogs, which he described as silent guardians, keeping him away from a kind of portal of light. He stated that they were not hostile, but neither were they friendly, just vigilant, preventing him from moving forward. Kübler-Ross treated the account with her usual sobriety. She avoided mystical interpretations and focused on the clinical and psychological aspects. She observed that episodes of prolonged cerebral anoxia can induce experiences of terror and sensations of suffocation, which might explain the suffocating atmosphere and the perception of menacing figures. However, She also recorded that the young man described specific details of the hospital environment that he couldn't have seen in an unconscious state, including the position of a defibrillator left on the floor and a comment made by one of the doctors during resuscitation. These objective elements obliged her to keep the investigation open regarding how consciousness might, under certain circumstances, operate outside known neurological parameters. What drew her attention the most, however, was the recurring mention of dogs. She recognized that, in various ancient traditions, there are references to canine figures that guard the boundaries between worlds, not as entities of punishment, but as watchmen or guides. For the researcher, this indicated that similar experiences might emerge from deep layers of the human imagination, shared across cultures, possibly evoked by extreme neurological states. She did not see this as proof that the young man had encountered real creatures, but she also did not consider it safe to dismiss the transcultural consistency of this symbol. The patient, recalling his sensation during the coma, mentioned feeling observed, as if something knew every detail of his life. When he finally reached the light, he described feeling relief and warmth, but, according to him, the dogs moved away and did not accompany him beyond the threshold. For Kübler-Ross, this kind of dramatic turning point, from the oppressive environment to a feeling of liberation, was typical of some near-death accounts, suggesting a possible pattern of psychological or physiological progression. She stressed in her notes that disturbing experiences should not be interpreted as moral punishment, but studied as legitimate phenomena of the dying process. She also noted that, even in cases with distressing content, the figure of an animal frequently appeared, either as a guide or as a guardian. She wondered whether the mind in agony might project these images as instinctive representations of protection or danger, or if there was something more that connected the human consciousness in transition and the perception of other living beings. Kübler-Ross never reduced such accounts to superstition, but neither did she elevate them to proofs of reincarnation or a literal afterlife. She reinforced that the true value of these cases lay in revealing still ununderstood aspects of the human mind, especially when confronted with the imminence of death. For her, the repetition of symbols, the presence of animals, and the shared perception between the patient and living observers indicated that there was a legitimate field of study there, one neglected by conventional science. Among the episodes Elisabeth Kübler-Ross considered most intriguing were those in which patients brought back, upon waking, specific information about events that occurred while they were clinically dead or in a deep coma. One such case involved a 64-year-old man, a victim of a massive heart attack that led to prolonged cardiac arrest. For 12 minutes, he had no measurable heart activity, being revived only after repeated defibrillation maneuvers. In the days following his initial recovery, he told the medical team that during the experience, he had floated above his own body, watching the doctors fighting for his life. He described accurately the placement of a stethoscope on his chest and commented that one of the nurses had dropped a syringe on the floor, which rolled under the emergency cart, a fact later confirmed by the professionals present in the resuscitation room. The detail that most impressed Kübler-Ross, however, did not concern the medical team, but the presence of the patient's dog. During the critical minutes, the animal was in the hospital parking lot, inside the family car. According to his wife, who remained in the waiting room, the dog began to bark and howl intensely at the exact moment the doctors declared cardiac arrest. The behavior stopped abruptly as soon as the heart rhythm was restored. For the researcher, the coincidence did not prove the perception of something beyond the physiological, but it deserved to be recorded as observational data. When questioned, the patient reported that, while watching the resuscitation scene from above, he also perceived his dog in the parking lot. He said the animal seemed to be looking toward the building, restless but not scared. He described the feeling that the dog recognized him, even in that state where he perceived himself as separated from his own body. Kübler-Ross highlighted in her notes that similar accounts had already emerged in other contexts and that, however subjective they were, they repeated themselves with a coherence difficult to ignore. She always maintained caution. She stressed that such perceptions could result from later memory constructions, combining sensory fragments unconsciously captured with symbolic images. Even so, she underlined that the precision with which some patients reported external events, like the dropped syringe, could not be easily explained only by residual brain activity. Kübler-Ross also recorded that, in ancient texts from different regions of the world, there were accounts of animals reacting to moments of death or transition, often being seen as companions of the traveler between worlds. She did not see in these records a confirmation of spiritual beliefs, but a historical continuity of human observations about something that seemed to transcend cultures and eras. The researcher argued that, instead of rejecting such phenomena as coincidences or superstitions, science should catalog and investigate them, applying rigorous methods, just as it does with states of consciousness induced by anesthesia or brain trauma. She believed that understanding the correlation between subjective experiences, clinical data, and observed behaviors in animals could open new frontiers for the study of the mind in extreme situations. For her, every case that combined a rich subjective account with a verifiable element in the external environment represented an opportunity to advance the understanding of what happens to human consciousness at the thresholds of life and death, and possibly how close beings, including animals, seem to participate in these critical moments. As the collection of cases grew, Elisabeth Kübler-Ross insisted that any attempt to interpret near-death experiences and the apparent sensitivity of animals to these moments needed to begin with an analysis of medical and neurological conditions. In her lectures, she often repeated that the researcher's first duty is to exhaust physiological explanations before seeking hypotheses that challenge the known laws of nature. Cerebral anoxia, caused by lack of oxygen during cardiac arrest, is known to induce visual and auditory alterations, often associated with tunnels of light and a feeling of floating. Furthermore, the discharge of neurotransmitters like endorphins and glutamate in extreme situations can generate vivid hallucinations, feelings of peace, or conversely, visions of fear and emptiness. For Kübler-Ross, these factors were unavoidable components in the scientific evaluation of the accounts. However, even taking these explanations into account, the doctor remained intrigued by the constant presence of certain patterns, especially the involvement of animals. She wondered if, in liminal states, the human mind, deeply connected to affective bonds, might project known figures, like dogs and cats, to reduce the panic of the unknown. This hypothesis of a psychological nature could explain why animals appear as companions or guardians in so many accounts, even when they are not physically present. On the other hand, there were cases where real, living animals reacted unusually in the same critical moments, which raised the question of a possible nonverbal communication between species in moments of transition. Kübler-Ross argued that human psychology is shaped not only by biological factors, but also by millennia of cultural narratives. In the records of ancient societies, descriptions are found of animals accompanying or watching over a person's passage beyond death. For her, this cultural data was not proof of a metaphysical reality, but an indicator that the mind, in situations of existential threat, tends to evoke universal symbols that provide meaning or orientation. This evocation could be explained by the activation of deep brain structures responsible for emotional responses and archetypal images. In discussions with colleagues in neurology and psychiatry, Kübler-Ross highlighted that the presence of verifiable elements in the accounts, such as objects seen in places where the patient could not physically be, or the unusual behavior of animals at the time of clinical death, challenged the view that everything was just hallucination. She did not state that such events demonstrated a survival of consciousness, but considered them anomalies that deserved systematic investigation. She drew attention to the risk of science losing important data by prematurely dismissing them as subjective illusions. The doctor also emphasized that understanding altered states of consciousness at the threshold of death could have implications for medical care. Patients who experienced NDE often returned with profound changes in their attitudes, reporting less fear of death and greater empathy. Recognizing these psychological effects could help in rehabilitation and post-trauma follow-up. She also observed that families who witnessed unusual reactions from animals in these moments often felt comforted, as if there were a continuity in the affective bond. Kübler-Ross maintained the position that science should study such phenomena without prejudice and without rushing to explain. She reiterated that the boundary between life and death is not just a biological problem, but also a question about the nature of consciousness, which perhaps involves forms of perception not yet understood. For her, animals were part of this equation, not because they represented proof of spiritual beliefs, but because they revealed a sensitive point of contact between the human and the non-human in the experience of transition. Over her decades of research, Elisabeth Kübler-Ross realized that contemporary NDE accounts involving animals did not arise in a vacuum. In her notebooks, she often noted parallels with ancient descriptions from peoples distant in time and space. She did not seek confirmation of spiritual beliefs in them, but clues that certain images, like that of the animal accompanying or watching over the dying person, have crossed centuries of human experience. This constancy suggested, in her view, that the phenomenon was rooted in the mind itself and in the historical relationship between human beings and animals. She cited, for example, texts from the Near East in which dogs were described as guardians of the invisible borders between the world of the living and the dead. In ancient inscriptions found in tombs, there are mentions of animals that were supposed to guide the deceased in their crossing. Also, in traditions from the Nile Valley, representations of an animal guide appear, who receives the recently deceased at the entrance to a domain beyond physical life. For Kübler-Ross, what mattered was not the cosmology of these cultures, but the repetition of the idea of a non-human companion at the threshold of death. She also analyzed ancient descriptions of funeral rites in which the behavior of dogs or birds was observed during a person's agony, interpreting such reactions as signs of imminent passage. She noted that, although these accounts were shrouded in myths, the empirical element, the fact that people noticed patterns of animal behavior at these moments, was worthy of record. She wondered if the acute sensitivity of certain animals to human physiological changes might have been interpreted in ancient times as spiritual perception. Kübler-Ross also found parallels in narratives from philosophical and poetic texts of later eras, which describe animals as loyal companions in death or as guardians of paths between worlds. For the doctor, the persistence of this motif indicated that it was not purely cultural, but perhaps resulted from a universal psychological mechanism, arising spontaneously in altered states of consciousness, whether due to fever, fasting, coma, or proximity to death. In her conferences, she often emphasized that modern science should not dismiss the value of such historical records. Although they were not proof of the survival of consciousness after death, they offered indirect evidence that the subjective experience of transition frequently includes the presence of an animal, real or imagined. For her, this transcultural repetition could help better understand the human psyche and its ways of facing the unknown. Kübler-Ross argued that the boundary between the physiological and the symbolic is thinner than many researchers admit. She considered it plausible that early humans, upon observing that dogs howled or birds changed behavior when someone was on the verge of death, attributed spiritual meanings to facts that might have been just instinctive reactions of animals to signals imperceptible to us. But she also left open the hypothesis that the human mind, in moments of transition, could emit subtle patterns that other life forms capture. In her writings, she insisted that the researcher's function is not to decide the nature of these phenomena beforehand, but to record, compare, and search for patterns. She reiterated that science could only benefit by recognizing that near-death experiences, both pleasant and disturbing ones, carry elements that have been repeating for millennia, and that animals seem to participate in these episodes in ways that we do not yet know how to explain. For Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, one of the greatest challenges was not the cases themselves, but the reaction of the academic community. From the beginning of her investigations, she noticed that mentioning the presence of animals in NDE accounts provoked even greater resistance than the descriptions of light tunnels or encounters with deceased people themselves. In clinical meetings, many colleagues considered that such elements belonged to the realm of folklore or superstition, unworthy of scientific attention. For Kübler-Ross, this posture was a symptom of a science that, in its eagerness to maintain rigid boundaries, sometimes closed itself off to real, albeit poorly understood, phenomena. She insisted that the duty of the doctor and the researcher is to observe and document, even that which seems anomalous. She argued that the boundary between the natural and the supernatural is often the result of our lack of knowledge, and that many medical discoveries began as strange accounts, scorned in their time. She recalled that, in the past, neurological symptoms were attributed to invisible forces before being recognized as manifestations of epilepsy or metabolic disorders. She asked why we couldn't consider near-death experiences, including the apparent animal sensitivity, as clues to better understanding the limits of consciousness. Kübler-Ross faced criticism from colleagues who accused her of encouraging irrational beliefs. For her, however, there was no contradiction between scientific skepticism and respect for patients' narratives. She insisted that the first step to investigating a phenomenon is to take it seriously as a human account. Immediately discarding experiences reported by those who were on the verge of death would be equivalent, she argued, to losing valuable information about the psyche and physiology in these liminal states. She repeated that her role was not to validate beliefs about reincarnation or life after death, but to understand what these experiences reveal about the mind and, potentially, about the bond between living beings. Ethical dilemmas also arose in the hospital environment. Doctors and nurses who witnessed unusual animal behavior, like dogs becoming agitated in the corridors or cats starting to silently watch over the beds of critical patients, often felt embarrassed to report such observations for fear of ridicule. Kübler-Ross argued that it was necessary to create a research environment where this type of data could be recorded without stigma. She emphasized that observing is not believing. It is simply recognizing that there is something to be studied. Another delicate point was the impact these accounts had on families. Some found comfort in the idea that their pets participated in the transition experience, interpreting it as a sign of continuity of the affective bond. Others, however, felt anguish in the face of disturbing accounts, such as the presence of somber animal figures. Kübler-Ross advocated that the doctor's role was to welcome these feelings with empathy and offer an understanding based on data, without imposing spiritual interpretations or hasty materialistic reductions. She also stressed that scientific rigor does not exclude openness to new questions. The investigation of NDE, she said, is not about proving dogmas, but about mapping an unknown territory of human experience. If animals appear repeatedly in the accounts and sometimes exhibit reactions that coincide with critical events, then this element deserves to be included in the analysis, alongside known physiological and psychological variables. For Kübler-Ross, ignoring this evidence because it seems strange would be an impoverishment of the scientific method itself. Over the years, Elisabeth Kübler-Ross began to realize that the study of NDE was not just about the moment of death, but about a deeper understanding of consciousness itself. In conferences for doctors and researchers, she emphasized that the near-death experience could be seen as a kind of natural laboratory for exploring the limits of human perception. She said that when vital functions decline and the brain collapses, the mind seems to react in ways that challenge conventional understanding. It is at this threshold that phenomena arise, such as the feeling of leaving the body, the perception of events at a distance, and, in many accounts, the presence of animal companions or guardians. For Kübler-Ross, the repetition of these patterns demanded that science reconsider some of its assumptions. She argued that consciousness, although dependent on the brain, might not be strictly limited to it. This idea did not mean, in her view, accepting supernatural explanations, but recognizing that current models of neuroscience may be insufficient to explain all the observed data. The presence or reaction of animals in critical moments, she said, could indicate that something, perhaps chemical, electrical signals, or even patterns not yet detected, extends beyond the human body and is picked up by other species. She also stressed that NDE offers a point of contact between science, medicine, and ethology. If patients' and family members' accounts of unusual reactions from dogs, cats, or birds are collected systematically, it is possible to compare them with objective clinical data. Time of cardiac arrest, blood oxygen levels, patterns of cerebral electrical activity. This approach could reveal correlations that go unnoticed today. Kübler-Ross believed that even if such studies were to show that everything is due to physiological or chemical stimuli, it would still be an advancement to understand how animals react to these subtle changes. Reflecting on the broader implications, she saw the topic not only as a scientific challenge, but also as an invitation to humility. The human tendency to underestimate the sensitivity of animals, she said, may have led science to ignore valuable clues about the processes of dying. For her, the observation that dogs or cats sometimes seem to react to the agony or recovery of a loved one could pave the way for research on little-known forms of biochemical or behavioral communication between species. Kübler-Ross also warned that hasty interpretations, both spiritual and materialistic, prevented progress. Attributing the animal's reactions to a perception of the soul can be as limiting as dismissing them as mere coincidence. The only truly scientific position, she insisted, is to collect data, identify patterns, and keep an open mind to hypotheses, however uncomfortable they may seem. This posture of persistent doubt was what, in her view, allowed her research to span decades without becoming mere dogma. In conversations with hospital teams, the doctor encouraged professionals, whenever possible, to record unusual events involving pets of critically ill patients. She believed that, in the future, such records could help build a valuable database, offering new clues for understanding the experience of dying. For her, studying the boundary between life and death required integrating subjective accounts, physiological data, and environmental observations, including animal behavior. Kübler-Ross saw in this integrated approach an opportunity to broaden medicine's view of the patient, not just as a biological organism, but as a being inserted into a network of affective bonds that manifests even in the final moments. The fact that these bonds sometimes seem to cross the barriers of unconsciousness and clinical death was, for her, not proof of reincarnation, but a legitimate mystery worthy of the most serious and rigorous investigation. In the later years of her career, Elisabeth Kübler-Ross began collaborating with research teams in hospitals that proved more receptive to the systematic collection of NDE accounts. Although she was already in a phase of life marked by health challenges, she maintained the rigor that always characterized her, insisting that the study of these phenomena needed to be multidisciplinary. She asked that hospitals, whenever possible, record not only patients' vital signs, but also observations made by family members, nurses, and even maintenance staff, any detail that could provide clues about the environment at the moment of the experiences. For her, understanding NDEs was not limited to what happened inside the patient's brain. It was necessary to analyze the entire context. A remarkable case from that phase involved a 15-year-old girl who fell into a coma after fulminant meningitis. During the 3 weeks she remained unconscious, the family reported that the girl's dog, a docile and calm animal, began to sleep on the threshold of the hospital room door, and only moved away to eat quickly. On more than one occasion, nurses noted that the dog would raise its head, become alert, and whine at the same moments when the heart monitors indicated abrupt drops in the patient's heart rate. When the teenager finally awoke, she described an intense experience of crossing a luminous corridor accompanied by indistinct figures and, clearly, by the presence of her dog, which supposedly led her back, as if showing her the way to return. Kübler-Ross, in commenting on this case, made a point of emphasizing that the deep affective bond between patient and animal could have influenced both the subjective experience and the observed behavior. She admitted that the dog could have reacted to chemical signals or subtle auditory changes coming from the hospital equipment without needing to resort to extraordinary explanations. Even so, she drew attention to the synchronization between the animal's reactions and the young woman's critical events, considering that this type of observation should be recorded and compared with clinical data. Another experience recorded during this period involved an elderly man in a terminal state who alternated between periods of lucidity and mental confusion. A few days before he died, he told a nurse that he saw a black cat sitting at the foot of the bed, something she did not observe. Curiously, the patient's daughter recounted that the family cat, which had stayed at home, had spent the last few nights standing in front of the owner's empty bedroom door, emitting low sounds as if waiting for someone. Kübler-Ross included this account in her archives as an example of how the patient's subjective perceptions can coincide, inexplicably, with changes in the behavior of a distant animal. The researcher believed that, although such stories could be interpreted as coincidences or psychological constructs, the repetition of the pattern deserved attention. She argued that if medicine accepts studying placebo and nocebo effects, phenomena in which subjective expectations produce real physiological effects, it should also consider the hypothesis that affective ties might play a role in how patients experience critical states and how animals react in those same moments. For Kübler-Ross, the message from these recent case studies was clear. The boundary between consciousness and environment is more permeable than science usually admits. Whether they are explained in the future by subtle biochemical processes or by something still unknown, the accounts of interaction between humans in a near-death state and their pets represent an opportunity to expand scientific investigation into the limits of life without abandoning skepticism or compassion. In the final years of her life, Elisabeth Kübler-Ross continued to repeat that she did not see her work as a confirmation of spiritual doctrines, but rather a call for scientific honesty. She said that near-death experiences and the curious role played by animals in these accounts are, first and foremost, data, and that the researcher's task is to welcome the data without reducing them to beliefs or discarding them for not fitting existing theories. For her, science only becomes more robust when it is capable of confronting anomalies with rigor and without prejudice. In her final lectures, she often recounted that what impressed her most in decades of listening were not the accounts of light tunnels or dark landscapes, but the constancy of certain human elements, the feeling of continuity of the bond with loved ones, the recurring presence of guides, often in the form of animals, and the transformative impact these experiences had on the lives of those who returned. Many patients reported that, after experiencing NDE, they lost their fear of death and began to value affective bonds more. Kübler-Ross argued that, regardless of any metaphysical explanation, this positive psychological effect deserved attention. Reflecting on the role of animals, the doctor insisted that they should not be seen as witnesses to something supernatural, but as part of the relational context in which the human being lives and dies. She highlighted that dogs, cats, and even pet birds are highly sensitive to physiological and emotional changes, and that this sensitivity may have a real, albeit poorly understood, role in critical moments. For her, recognizing this did not diminish the mystery of the phenomenon, but allowed it to be studied without resorting to extraordinary assumptions. Kübler-Ross also drew attention to the ethical importance of listening to patients. She affirmed that NDE accounts, with or without the presence of animals, are not mere fantasies, but part of the lived experience of people in extreme situations. Ignoring or ridiculing these narratives would mean not only losing valuable data, but also failing in human care. Attentive listening, she said, is a form of respect for the dignity of those who have crossed the boundary between life and death. In her final reflections, the researcher acknowledged that science may never be able to fully answer the questions raised by these experiences. But she maintained that the pursuit of knowledge does not require absolute certainty. It requires the courage to face the unknown. She saw in NDE a liminal territory where the biological, the psychological, and the symbolic intertwine. And she saw in the animal companions, guides, or sentinels, not an argument in favor of beliefs about reincarnation, but a key to understanding the profound interconnection between living beings in moments of transition. Kübler-Ross died without offering definitive answers. Her legacy was the attitude of someone who questions with humility, documents with rigor, and recognizes that the human mind, perhaps along with other life forms that surround us, may manifest aspects that still escape scientific explanation. For her, investigating these frontiers does not diminish science. On the contrary, it broadens its vision of what it means to live and, inevitably, to die. Thus, the narrative of her research concludes that the question that gives title to this documentary, "Do animals perceive the reincarnation of close souls?" remains open. The available evidence does not allow us to state that animals perceive reincarnation, but it strongly suggests that, in the liminal moments of human existence, they capture something that we, with our instruments, still do not know how to measure. It is in this tension between mystery and method, doubt and compassion, that the true legacy of Elisabeth Kübler-Ross resides.